Hello and welcome to the Radio Academy podcast with me, Roisin Hasty. We've got a great one this week from some radio legends who've also mastered podcasting.
We genuinely have won awards for broadcasting. I've done some very serious interviews in my time. I really have.
And I've been to the UN.
And you've been to the UN, yeah. Okay.
That's the absolute magic of your podcast, is that it is literally you being 100% authentically you as friends, and all the chaos and the unpredictability of that.
Of course, those are the voices of Radio 4's Jane Garvey and Fee Glover, who host the brilliant Fortunately podcast. And former Radio 1 DJ Annie Macmanus, whose podcast Changes is one of my personal favourites. For this episode, we've rounded up some highlights from a Radio Academy talk they did at the podcast show. Now, they're obviously so experienced in both radio and podcasting. And we just thought that what they said was so good that we needed to share it on this podcast with you too. So let's get to it.
We are going to play some clips. We're going to start with one from Annie's Changes. Now, this is actually a really good example of something that probably couldn't be done as well on radio if it's done at all. Can you just, before we hear it, can you just set it up for us? Because you're talking to your husband.
Yeah, sounds like a bit of a cop-out, interviewing your husband, like a bit of an easy win. But I guess the thing that we talk about is his own mental health journey and his own neurodiversity, specifically an adult diagnosis of ADHD, that he kind of spent the last few years learning about, discovering and trying to figure out a way to live with. So we had this, it kind of felt like a therapy session. It wasn't planned to, but we just sat down and had it out. And I'd done a bit of research. And the clip you're going to hear is me kind of talking him through his diagnosis.
Okay, here we go.
You have been diagnosed with inattentive ADHD. And so much of the research that I've done for this podcast has been so incredibly enlightening and so incredibly about you and us and our relationship and everything. So inattentive ADHD symptoms are as follows: missing details and becoming distracted easily. Trouble focusing on the task at hand.
Oh, for sure.
Becoming bored quickly.
Yes, sir.
Difficulty learning or organising new information. Becoming confused easily or daydreaming frequently. Seeming not to listen when spoken to directly.
Never that.
Difficulty following instructions. See also maps of any kind.
Oh, wow, yeah, map life.
That's awful, because it just sounds like I'm going, and another thing. But there's a whole conversation around that of, I think it definitely had the biggest reaction to any podcast I've ever done.
Right.
And I think part of that was timely. I think it's because people come out of COVID and they had a lot of time for introspection, and a lot of people thought they had ADHD. And also I think it was the perspective of the conversation, which was about us as a couple. So living with someone in a couple who has ADHD and how that affects a relationship. So that was kind of, I think, a bit of a unique take on it.
And is it something that you would ever have been able to do in any of your other professional walks of life? So on the radio, or writing about it, or being interviewed, in print about it, would that have happened?
No, I don't think it would have. There's something about the conversation, I think, that he felt more comfortable with, that was less formal, that meant he could and I could be 100% authentically ourselves. And I mean, that's the reason why I started podcasting, is because I wanted to have long, meandering conversations that could turn left or right and go wherever you wanted. And I was so used to live radio, where, a lot of the time you'd have an interview with an artist before the show, and you might have a half an hour interview and it would end up being 3 minutes on air, and you'd be like, God damn it. So there was a kind of this growing frustration of wanting to have these long conversations and wanting to be able to allow them to happen, and also knowing and kind of sensing and also hoping, because it was a guest, that audiences wanted them. Because I kind of was trained in radio to believe that people didn't. They didn't want you to talk for a long time. But that was coming from the perspective of a music radio station.
Yeah. Try Radio 4. That's all they want.
True. Okay, well, let's hear a bit now, fortunately. So this is a bit of you two discussing the author Ken Follett's Mammary Memories.
By the way, if you've got tiny people listening, you may want to just sing loudly for the next 30 seconds. He ran his hand down her neck and across her bosom. Her breasts had changed too. I can't do it, Jane. He remembered when they had stuck out from her chest as if they were weightless, the nipples pointing up. Then when she was pregnant, they'd become even bigger.
Gosh. Come on, you've set yourself a challenge. Keep going.
And the nipples had grown larger. Now they were lower and softer. Do you
want me to take over?
I just can't do it.
Sorry. And no, see, I can't.
Now, come on, you're a friend of Ken. Gather, darling, gather.
And they swung delightfully from side to side as she walked.
I mean,
doesn't bear much scrutiny, that, to be honest. We genuinely have won awards for broadcasting. I've done some very serious interviews in my time. I really have.
And I've been to the UN.
And you've been to the UN, yeah. Okay. And we're now reduced to reading out extracts from Ken Follett novels. That, by the way, is from The Pillars of the Earth.
Right.
It's page 1070. And that is true. It is true, isn't it?
But it is an example of, and we wanted to choose something that just really clearly exemplified what we can't do in our other working lives on radio and what we can do in a podcast and just about get away with, or actually be in, that particular bit, whatever you want to call it, was actually really embraced by the audience. Because I think some of the reason, as we've all learnt, that you listen to podcasts is a bit like taking a warm bath. It's not always as much about the content as the way the content makes you feel.
Right.
So it's the kind of, I don't know, it's a bit like having a diffuser. That's the equivalent, isn't it? It kind of makes
the White
an hour.
Company.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah,
A nice vetivier, or however you pronounce it. Which is just a very different thing when you're making it, isn't it? You're driven, I think, by something a little bit different, which perhaps doesn't bear too much scrutiny either.
Yeah.
We're kind of winding ourselves up and letting us go, aren't we?
But I mean, that's the absolute magic of your podcast, is that it is literally you being 100% authentically you as friends, and all the chaos and the unpredictability of that. As soon as you start trying to produce you, it would sound ridiculous in that context.
Do you remember, we've been interviewed several, I don't like to boast, but we've been interviewed several times by The Big Show, Steve Wright in the afternoon. Right. And I have to say, what appears on air, because we always listen then to the whole show to find, when we're going to be on.
Yeah.
Sometimes we've been reduced to 25 seconds?
Yes,
after talking to the great man for up to 15, 20 minutes, we were really hoping for a big slice of the show. I'm not going to say that's the opposite of authenticity, but also I think there's a place in the audio world for highly produced radio, like Steve Wright in the afternoon, which I happen to really like.
Yeah, but there's also a place for the opposite.
Yes.
And there hasn't really been that type of thing in a mainstream level before you guys, I don't think. Has there? I can't think of any podcast that has existed, fortunately, in the UK.
Well, that's kind of you to say so. We don't listen to anyone else's podcast.
Too busy making your own.
Yeah. Just to let you know what will happen in this session, you're very welcome to ask questions as we go along. Please don't wait for the end, because we haven't got an enormous time allowed for questions. So whatever it is that we're talking about, or maybe if you just want to aerate your armpits, just put your hand up.
Anyone got any questions?
Hi. My question is kind of, I guess it's not such a direct question, but talking about the sort of gendered balance in podcasting. I wonder if you think there's something about the medium of podcasts which allows women to speak in a way which they're very rarely heard in different forms of media, and this kind of looser, more kind of bantery way. And if that's a kind of contrast which you think applies to men in media as well, or if you think their kind of on-air personas are much more similar to their podcast.
That's a good question.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd say that's directly applicable to you guys, right? In that when you started, you were able to talk in a way that you never were previously in broadcasting.
Yeah.
Is that safe to say?
It's very safe to say. And actually, we do talk about that a bit in our little book. That both of us, we grew up in broadcasting terms, in a world that really asked us to ape male broadcasting styles in order to be successful. So you definitely had to be assertive. Sometimes I think you had to be borderline aggressive. That was what you had to be on air. And the idea that 30 years ago you'd be able to go on air and admit your vulnerabilities in the way that both Jane and I do, unfortunately, you just wouldn't have got a job. It just wouldn't have been possible. No. But it's a really good question about whether or not that is the same.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we had Hugh Edwards on, fortunately, the week before last, and I think it's probably, with the exception of the edition in which Will Self appeared, the Hugh Edwards episode has been the most divisive episode we've ever done. I mean, we enjoyed talking to him, but he's got an incredibly dry, acerbic wit, which I have to be honest, didn't necessarily translate into an enjoyable listen to people who were not sitting in the piazza with us and Hugh. But he talked about his own vulnerabilities and about his mental health and the fact that he's been diagnosed with depression. And frankly, how I think a boss at the BBC said, we don't want a nutter reading the news, when he talked to his bosses about his diagnosis.
And that was just 3 years ago.
That's not long ago, no. So that's not really an answer to your question. But we don't... So we will sometimes have an experience with a guest, unfortunately, and we've enjoyed being with them, but sometimes the audience doesn't enjoy it in the same way. That's a very good question.
Any more questions?
Hi. I feel a bit embarrassed asking this, but I've never ever heard why you decided to call it Fortunately.
Oh God, there's such a boring reason for that.
And secondly,
is that going to be your question too?
How much?
Oh, right, okay, double question.
Secondly, please, how much preparation do you do?
Has anybody got any other questions? It's called Fortunately because of Radio 4, is that right?
Yes, because Radio 4, the only other podcast series that they had was called Seriously, which is where they put their documentaries every week, and they wanted something to sit alongside Seriously. So originally it was called Fortunately with a U in it, Radio 4, but that just never made it through the spell check, I think. So it just ended up being Fortunately.
And you're right, it is a good question, because it's actually a good title now, isn't it? But it makes not really any sense, but that's not such a bad thing. Yeah.
How long did it take you to come up with changes?
It was just whether it should be change or changes. It didn't take long to figure out.
Yeah,
we knew it was going to be about changes.
You didn't do a PowerPoint presentation.
No PowerPoint. No.
As for the preparation
that's
part of your
when
question,
you're not at the beep. You don't have to do the PowerPoints.
That is a really.
Our preparation is immense, Jane. We're dedicated to it. We spend hours and hours and hours in research.
Well, when you interviewed me, you asked me what was DJing. There you go. I explained it.
It's one of our better questions. I think part of the ramshackle appeal was that we don't do any preparation. In fact, what does the contract say? We have to spend...
Oh, so it says in the contract, which we're not allowed to talk about, so you can't say that we ever said this, that we must spend no more than 2 hours researching our guests and considering anecdotes.
It's so
considering
BBC
anecdotes.
That you're given a time
No
parameter.
more than 2 hours. So if we come up with a joke at 2 hours, 3 minutes, it's out. Never
Can't be used.
Never makes it in. Yeah.
That's mad.
So no, we never talk. Fee and I do talk. We have a friendship genuinely. Although I think it's been through some pressures, hasn't it, over the last couple of years? We have never spent so much time together, and I think it's quite a strain for poor Fee. I do feel sorry for her at times. Do you feel sorry for me at all?
I do.
Thank you.
You're always very quick to say that, and I never quite know how to respond.
What else could she say? But we never talk about what we're going to talk about, ever. Which is why, I mean, some weeks, let's face it, there isn't a lot to talk about, because my life's incredibly dull. And
mine's no better. I think it must be incredibly frustrating at the moment to want to enter the podcasting world, to watch celebrities just get a podcast. I mean, it's like, as soon as you reach a certain level of celebrity, you have to have a podcast, you have to be downloadable as an app. That's just a kind of given. And I think some of the stuff that's out there is actually quite dull by celebrities. It's a chumocracy. Find something that is different now, because everybody's talking to people in an authentic way. We have been lucky to be there, at the kind of, at a very pivotal point in the world of podcasting, and to leap from one platform to the other. So I'd say find something different that nobody's talking about in a chatty, authentic, revealing of themselves way, and that might well be the future.
And be daring. You know, I'm trying to think of something. I mean, I know there was a session earlier on from the people behind the 28-ish Days Later podcast. Now, honestly, who'd have thought that the BBC would commission, I mean, they should have done, obviously, a 28-part series about the menstrual cycle. It wouldn't have been thought of as a decent thing to do or a sensible thing to do even 5 years ago. So things are really changing and the boundaries are being pushed, and you could say periods have been around for quite some time now. So maybe somebody should have thought about doing this earlier. But the plain fact is it wasn't ever thought of.
Yeah.
You know, I could kick myself, frankly, that I didn't have the idea. But there are so many. They're not niche areas, because if they are things that you're passionate about, then you know, I heard a guy yesterday just so excited about the opening of the Elizabeth line. You know, I don't understand it, but it meant the world to him. And he said, it was great because the YouTube's leading train spotter was there, and obviously you couldn't get close to him because he was surrounded by a crowd. And I'm thinking, I'll bet, But you know, it was just so gentle and sweet and passionate. And if that fella's thing is the Elizabeth line, you know, good luck to him. You know,
and
nothing wrong with it.
I would say as well, like those podcasts that are based on interviews with people with a high profile, there is such competition for guests. There's so many of those podcasts doing the same thing, and what you find is that there's kind of like chain gang of people just being guests on other people's podcasts, hosting your podcast. It can feel like a very, very crowded cart. Right. Yeah. So if you can find an idea or a podcast that doesn't rely on famous people, it's really, really good.
And if you come up with a very good idea, if you can say that Joan and I helped you along the way, then you're very welcome.
Or you just want to give the idea to us. That would be great.
No, good luck. I hope something comes for you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Should we call it a day?
Yes, I think we've got to.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed that, you won't want to miss our upcoming event to meet the team behind the ARIA award-winning UK Station of the Year.
Let's go! The Hits Radio Breakfast Show. With Fly. Across the UK. Hits Radio.
Yeah, Mary Manderfield will be speaking to the team at Hits Radio on the 16th of June, looking back at 2021 and how the station thrived through such a difficult year. She'll be joined by presenter Fleur East, programme director Paul Gerard, senior executive producer Steph Hill and head of news Michelle Livesey. They'll all be discussing their key projects and features and what went into that award-winning entry. You will not want to miss it. It's free for Radio Academy members. You can join now for just £3 a month. As always, we'd love to hear your ideas and suggestions for future episodes of this podcast. You can email us at podcast@radioacademy.org. Thanks for listening.